Good afternoon, I'm Dr. Ashley Espinel, curatorial assistant for the Whitney Western Art Museum. And so thank you so much for coming to join us. We have a wonderful speaker with us today, but before I introduce him, I have a couple of thank yous that I wanted to do. So first off, I don't know if she's here, but thank you to Kathy Thompson and the Cody Chamber of Commerce for organizing today's luncheon and inviting us at the Whitney to be co-hosts. And thank you, Kathy, also for helping to organize all of the wonderful Rendezvous Royale events taking place this week. Also, thank you. Yes, clap, clap, clap. Hopefully, you all will be able to enjoy those great events. It's my first Rendezvous Royale this year, so I'm getting the feel of it. So far, so good. Thank you to our wonderful staff here at the Center of the West for helping us to prepare and set up for all of the wonderful events taking place here this week. And thank you today in particular to Bravo Catering for providing us with the wonderful, delicious lunch that we're having today. So thank you all. One last thank you. I want to thank all of our generous supporters of the Whitney's Peter Hassrick Public Programs Fund. Your generosity helped us to bring in today's speaker, the acclaimed author and historian of Western American art, Mr. Byron Price. Now, for those of you familiar with the world of Western American art, Byron probably doesn't need an introduction, but we're going to give him one anyway, and I will try to keep it short so that we can get to him. Byron is a 1970 graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, and he earned a master's in museum science at Texas Tech University in 1977. After that, he spent nearly 25 years in the museum profession, serving as the executive director of the Panhandle Plains Historical Museum, the National Cowboy Hall of Fame and Western Heritage Museum, and of course, our very own Buffalo Bill Historical Center, now known as the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. Until his recent retirement, which was very well deserved, he held the Charles Marion Russell Memorial Chair and served as the director of the Charles M. Russell Center for the Study of Art of the American West at the University of Oklahoma. In case he wasn't busy enough during that time, he also served as the director of the University of Oklahoma Press. I was one of the lucky many who was able to count Byron among my professors and mentors during his time at OU. A fact for which I will forever be thankful. He was one of the many people who helped me get through my dissertation and got me through my doctoral program. So thank you, Byron. Byron is also the author of more than 36 essays and journal articles on Western American art and history, as well as numerous books. His most recent book, Edward Boreen, Etched by the West, won the 2022 Western Heritage Award for the Best Art Book of the Year from the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. As one of the country's foremost scholars on the artist Charles M. Russell, Byron served as the editor of the Russell Catalog Raisonné, the definitive reference for scholars, collectors, curators, art dealers, and anyone else who appreciates the art of Russell. And he will be sharing that expertise today in his lecture, Playing Cowboy, Charlie Russell and the Silver Screen, as he discusses Russell's influence on Western cinema and how Western movies influenced Russell's art. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Byron Price.
Thank you, Ashley, for that generous introduction. Certainly better than I deserve. It's such a pleasure to be here today and to look out on this group and see so many friends, and I don't say former friends, but some of the folks that have really been instrumental in shaping my life, and this institution was certainly instrumental in that, and I appreciate every single day that I served here as director. And there are many days when I wake up and I say, what are they doing in Cody? And then I can pretty much guess. It's a real pleasure also to be in this lecture series honoring my dear friend Peter Hassrick, who certainly deserves all of the credit for moving Western art scholarship forward, and he was a great role model for all of us, and we need to recognize him. Today I'm going to talk about Charles M. Russell and the movies with a side trip looking at Russell and his work in theater, which you may not be aware of. Let's start by seeing if I can work the machinery. In the left foreground of this 1922 oil painting, Charles M. Russell and his friends, the artist sits horseback in the shadow of a passing cloud, his left arm and hand extended in an open gesture toward the scene unfolding in the center of the canvas. There, bathed in sunlight, a bevy of cowboys and Indians gallop up out of the Missouri River breaks onto the grassy plains above, dominated in the distance by Square Butte, a familiar Montana landmark that appears in some of Russell's finest paintings. A gift from the artist to the stockbroker Malcolm McKay, a Montana native and avid patron of Russell's work, the painting enjoyed a place of prominence above the fireplace in McKay's New Jersey home. At first glance, Charles M. Russell and his friends merely appears to introduce the cast of characters long associated with the artist and his work. Compared, however, to McKay's original suggestion for the space, an enlargement of Russell's 1907 watercolor caricature of Western types called I Savvy These Folks, the scale, theatricality, and action of the latter painting, as well as the time of its production, demand a more nuanced interpretation. The theatrical pose that Russell strikes in Charles M. Russell and his friends is reminiscent of a similar gestures employed by artists and actors since ancient times. The Montana painter assumed a similar posture, usually on foot in front of a group of watercolor self-portraits, some of them embedded in letters which commented to friends about current events. Russell's oil also recalls Charles Wilson Peele's self-portrait, The Artist, in his museum, produced nearly a century earlier, in which Peele, playing the role of impresario, gestures open-handedly to the viewer while lifting a curtain revealing the essence of his own life's work as a scientist and artist. In contrast to the lifeless taxidermy specimens, articulated skeletons, and stately portraits that inhabit Peele's museum, however, the animated characters who respond to Charles M. Russell's curtain call in Charles M. Russell and His Friends flock to a timeless, colorful, and vibrant outdoor stage occupying a rectangular panorama that anticipates the evolving shape of a modern motion picture screen. Indeed, Russell's choice of pose and presentation in his work reflects not only his ongoing love of stage and screen, actors and actors, but is also indicative of his symbiotic relationship that developed during his lifetime between art and film, inspired by the American West. Charles M. Russell had embraced the theatrical world long before he and his wife Nancy spent the first of 6 consecutive winters among the actors and motion picture studios of Southern California in 1920. Russell was a born performer with a reputation as an entertaining storyteller, often while engaged in the magical act of transforming a small lump of wax or clay into a figure of a bear, a horse, or other animal. From Indian friends along the way, he had also learned Indian Sign Language, and with his wife's help, later parlayed this skill into an engaging vaudeville-style act that he performed occasionally for his friends and patrons. There were subtle connections between this hand talk and the gestures that actors in silent films of the day depended upon to communicate to their audiences. While still a cowpuncher, Russell may have glimpsed the origins of the American cinema during the his 1893 visit to the Chicago World's Fair, where some of his art was exhibited at the Montana State Building. Just outside the World's Fair, where some of his art was exhibited, the Great Falls Cowboy could not have missed the arena where Buffalo Bill's Wild West and Congress of the Rough Riders of the World performed twice daily exhibitions of fancy riding and shooting and enacted historical tableaus depicting the winning of the West. Punctuated by gunfire and war whoops, these thrilling sequences foreshadowed the advent, a decade later, of action-packed feature films set in the American West. The Chicago Exposition's crowded Midway was home to Zoopraxical Hall. Try to say Zoopraxical Hall 3 times rapidly. It's very difficult. Zoopraxical Hall was a modern motion picture theater of sorts where the famed photographer Edward Muybridge delivered illustrated lectures on animal locomotion. The photographer's pioneering work had already revolutionized the portrayal of action in art and illustration, and the moving images that accompanied his presentation entertained as well as informed. At the nearby Street in Cairo attraction, Russell encountered other forms of locomotion, including live camels, a Ferris wheel, and perhaps even the exotic dancers who performed the notorious act inside the building known as the Persian Palace of Eros. I think Al was there at some point. If Charlie Russell did not witness such performances in Chicago, he had ample opportunity to do so closer to home in the decade to come. Charles and Nancy Russell had scarcely moved to Great Falls when, in December of 1897, the scandalous exotic dancer known as Little Egypt headlined a bill of vaudeville acts at the town's concert hall. That same year, she performed the Hoochie Coochie in a short motion picture. In June 1901, the community of Great Falls hosted a traveling carnival and street fair inspired by the Midway in Chicago. Carnival organizers reprised a modest version of the 1893 Exposition's famous Street in Cairo attraction and was said to have staffed it with Syrians, Turks, Egyptians, and Arabs. That's in Great Falls. Among this contingent were 5 Palestinian dancers headed by the sultry Belle Fatima, a star of a series of international short films shown in arcades and vaudeville theaters in the late 1890s and early 1900s. An exhibition of Thomas Edison's famous projectoscope, the famed inventor's device for delivering living pictures to a screen, also accompanied the live entertainment. The visual fair included short subjects that ranged from views of war to the inauguration of President McKinley. The carnival and fair opened with a floral parade and closed with a Mardi Gras-style procession and masquerade party involving the community. This alluring photo, probably taken on this occasion, shows a veiled Nancy Russell, clad in harem attire, lounging on a cushion in the living room of her Great Falls home. What role Charlie Russell, if any, may have assumed in this event is a mystery. He certainly enjoyed playing make-believe and at times donned regalia and utilized props from his studio to assume an imaginary role that either a social event, a character in one of his paintings, or his own sly, self-deprecating sense of humor demanded. Here he is clowning with, in front of some friends in Great Falls in front of his studio, and another who was quite a trick roper in his time. In 1904, Russell exhibited several paintings at the St. Louis World's Fair, and later that year departed briefly from his typical cowboy and Indian subject matter to paint Street Scene in Arabia, the first of 2 works bearing that title and based on sights he had observed at the fairs in Chicago, St. Louis, and Great Falls. Nancy Russell, in her masquerade outfit, may have posed as the dancer. During the Russells' early years in Great Falls, the town's Grand Opera House was the hub of community cultural activity. Built in 1891, the substantial sandstone and brick structure regularly hosted touring stage productions, lecturers such as Mark Twain, and vaudeville performers of all kinds. The couple frequently attended such events, and in February 1902 met the actor William S. Hart and several other cast members of the traveling play The Christian. A veteran thespian, Hart was the same age as Russell and shared the artist's love of the West. The men reconnected in early 1904 when Charles and Nancy Russell spent 3 months in Manhattan promoting Charlie's art with publishers, galleries, and collectors. During the couple's stay, the actor took them on a memorable sightseeing tour of the Big Apple. The Montanans' eastern sojourn probably also included a viewing of the groundbreaking Western motion picture, The Great Train Robbery, which had been released to distributors shortly before the Russells arrived in New York in December of 1903. Filmed in New Jersey, the 12-minute movie, The First with a Plot, proved an instant sensation with the American audiences. And by the time Charles and Nancy returned home in March, an estimated 5 million people had seen the film in New York and other major U.S. cities. If they missed seeing The Great Train Robbery in Manhattan, the Russells did not have to wait long for the film's July 3rd debut at the Edison Family Theater in Great Falls. There it ran 3 times a day on weekdays, 4 times a day on weekends and holidays, and headed a vaudeville playbill that also included comedy musicians and a contortionist. In 1905, William S. Hart landed his first Western role, playing the villain in a Broadway stage production, The Squaw Man. Hart insisted on authenticity in the overall look of his production, if not the melodramatic dialogue, and convinced that the play's producer to equip the cast with real cowboy gear acquired from a Colorado supplier. Hart's new cowboy persona drew accolades from such Western luminaries as William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, who was in the audience on opening night, and the famed Dodge City, Kansas lawman Bat Masterson, who is now a New York sports writer. Encouraged by the positive reception of his portrayal of a Western hero, Hart undertook the title role in the Broadway stage production, an adaptation of Owen Wister's novel, The Virginian, in 1908. Charlie and Nancy Russell were on hand in February of the following year when Hart's touring company performed the play in Great Falls. They greeted the actor's train, hosted him and his leading lady for dinner in their home, and presented Hart with a flattering equestrian portrait depicting him as the Virginian. And this is in the William S. Hart home, California, if you care to try to run it down. By the time the Russells welcomed William S. Hart back to Great Falls in 1909, they had become acquainted with another captivating stage talent, Will Rogers. The couple got to know the trick-roping comedian the previous year in New York, where he was transitioning from the rodeo arena to the vaudeville stage. Rogers, a gifted raconteur himself, was immediately captivated by Russell's art and storytelling. The 19-teens were an especially productive decade for Charles and Nancy Russell and their friends Will Rogers and William S. Hart. Russell was doing his best work yet and reaching an expanding market in the U.S. and Canada. Hart and Rogers, meantime, had found new fields for their talent in the burgeoning motion picture industry on the West Coast. In 1909, Los Angeles, a community of nearly 300,000 people, welcomed the first permanent studio to booming Southern California, and by 1912, as many as 15 film companies were operating in Hollywood alone. There were others in other communities. William S. Hart joined the exodus of East Coast actors and filmmakers to California in the spring of 1914, making 2 Western movies within the first 2 months of his arrival. They were really knocking them out. A lucrative run with the Ziegfeld Follies on Broadway, however, kept Will Rogers from moving west until 1919. That year, he was flush enough to buy a major buffalo hunting painting from his friend Charlie Russell, and this is the painting that he bought, which is at the Amon Carter Museum now. Charles and Nancy Russell caught up with Hart and Rogers when the Montana couple returned to Los Angeles in 1920. Their first visit to the city since a 2-week stay in Southern California on their way home from Mexico in 1906. Their initial stopover did not go unnoticed by the press. A Los Angeles Herald reporter interviewed the couple and favorably compared the Cowboy artist's work to that of Frederick Remington. Although the couple insisted that their first visit to California was, quote, purely for pleasure, Nancy Russell was always on the lookout for new patrons for her husband's work. While the Russells claimed to have been thoroughly delighted with Los Angeles, they did not return to the city for 14 years. In the interim, they stayed in touch with their show business friends on both coasts and continued to patronize the Broadway stage in New York and the Grand Opera House in their hometown. In 1915, for example, the couple attended the Great Falls debut of the play Disraeli after having seen the acclaimed drama twice in New York the previous season. Nancy Russell gave the traveling production her, quote, unqualified endorsement, close quote, in the Great Falls Tribune, and called its leading man, George Arliss, quote, one of the most capable actors that she had ever seen. The newspaper gushed with some exaggeration that Nancy had, quote, seen all the stars of prominence during her travels. By the time Charles and Nancy Russell were ready to return to Southern California in 1920, Great Falls boasted its own professional dramatic troupe known as the Associated Players. Russell had already gained a first-hand appreciation of theatrical set design and production a few years before, when members of the local Episcopal Church asked him to design the scenery for a local production of Little Almond Eyes, a 2-act musical comedy set in China. The artist's spirited recreation of the Imperial Garden in Cathay was praised by the local theater critic. Russell also served as makeup artist for the play and apparently relished the chance to apply comic faces to the actors in the show. It would not be his last such opportunity. Although he apparently enjoyed attending and occasionally contributing his talents to the success of Great Falls theater productions, and there were a number of theaters in Great Falls, here showing two, the Orpheum there at the bottom on the right, the little sign there, and then the Liberty Theater were big and among some of the bigger ones among the local theaters. Russell's real entertainment passion was motion pictures, especially westerns. In 1915, he admitted to an old cowboy crony, Wallace Coburn, that in recent years he had spent, quote, quite a little coin attending screen roundups, close quote, at several Great Falls theaters. Coburn, the author of a Russell illustrated volume of Western poetry called Rhymes of the Roundup Camp, published in 1903, understood the attraction of the movies. In 1913, he had opened the Bison Theater in Malta, Montana, and had decorated the auditorium and the lobby with a colorful assortment of Native American artifacts and taxidermy, and you can see those on the walls on either side in this rather poor photograph, but best that we could do. Believing that the typical Western movie did not do justice to the subject, Coburn and a handful of Minnesota investors organized the Great West Film Company in 1915, intending to undertake short commercial films designed to promote tourism and economic development in the region, as well as feature-length productions. It failed miserably. News of Coburn's apparent lack of Coburn's plans apparently struck a sentimental chord with Charlie Russell, who sent his friend a long letter, part of which was quoted in the Motion Picture World magazine under the title, quote, Real Cowboy and Screen Kind. In this missive, Russell pined for the real cowboys he and Coburn had known as youngsters, the kind that, quote, knew horses and could tell you what a cow said to her calf, close quote. In the cowboy artist's estimation, movie buckaroos were an alien species, not down in natural history, as Russell said. A pair of equestrian portraits illustrated this letter, one representing the cowboy of the silver screen on the left, and the other a proud old rawhider of the old Montana range on the right. Charles and Nancy Russell were not far behind Coburn in reaching Southern California. After renting a home there in the winter in Pasadena in January 1920, the couple reconnected with Hart, Rogers, and other old friends and began to pursue new patrons for Charlie's art. Bill Hart remained the couple's favorite movie star, and Charlie Russell saw many of his films more than once. After attending Hart's movie on the night stage in Great Falls in 1916, he told a local newspaper reporter, quote, that he would rather miss the best Christmas dinner ever prepared than fail to see Hart on the screen. Not long after Russell reached Los Angeles, Hart invited him to the set of his latest Western, The Toll Gate. I'm sure it was terrific. A similar offer soon followed from another old friend, the actor Tom Mix, who was making The Daredevil, an action-packed thriller that showcased the death-defying stunts of the flashy star. The actor had known Russell since 1903, when the cowboy artist later wrote a friend that Mix owned a saddle and a pair of spurs, and if you had asked him where Hollywood was, he wouldn't have known if it was a line camp or a state. Although Charlie Russell found much to complain about in Southern California, he wholeheartedly embraced the cinematic Wild West created there. The artist recognized the incongruities of the shoot-'em-ups of the day and found them more amusing than troubling. Besides, they fed his own growing nostalgia for the Old West. And here are a couple of lobby cards that were signed to Russell by one of the stars of the day, Neil Hart. No relation to William S. Hart. Russell especially appreciated the dangerous stunt work that enlivened many of the Western films of the day and marveled at the courage of the men and women who risked their lives to entertain the audience. It takes several kinds to make a hero on the screen, he wrote one of his cowboy compadres. The beautiful cowboy that makes love till the reformers want to burn the picture houses down ain't the same man that spurs his horse off a 30-foot rim into the water and swims 3 miles to save his sweetheart from a band of outlaws. And here he shows the latter. While the artist agreed with those who believe that alcohol often contributed to a stuntman's bravery, he recalled in a letter to another Montana friend the words of an Indian who once told him that, quote, that it wasn't the head that made men brave, it was the heart. If his talk was right, the artist concluded, these movie punchers had an enlargement of the heart and a shrinkage of the head. I seen them ride down hills that I wouldn't do with a ladder. Nevertheless, around this time, Russell provided a letter of introduction for an aspiring young cowboy and bronc rider from Great Falls who was apparently interested in breaking into the movie business as a wrangler, a stuntman, or an extra. It read, to Harry Carey, Bill Hart, Tom Mix, Douglas Fairbanks, Neil Hart, Bill Rogers, and any other movie man that wants riders. This note will introduce Fred R. Warrington, a friend of mine and an all-around horseman who is a good packer and knows a rope and likes horses. If any of you want a man of this kind, put a horse under Warrington. This will be a favor to me, a kindness to the horse, a job for Warrington, and a horseman to him that hires him. And that's Charlie Russell's at his best as a rider. Harry Carey, another cowboy actor, did his own stunts, and he early on welcomed Russell to his ranch at Saugus, California, a short drive from Los Angeles. The property doubled on occasion as a shooting location for Western films, and the actor built an adobe cabin shown there on the right. Or I guess it's not shown on the right until I show it to you on the right. This adobe cabin, especially for Russell's use as a studio and a refuge from urban Los Angeles. Carey and his wife, Olive, who was also an actress, were gracious hosts who enjoyed entertaining friends. Surviving photographs taken on their ranch in the early 1920s show the artist in the company of such acclaimed Western writers as Eugene Manlove Rhodes, Frank H. Spearman, Will James, and actors Fred Stone and Will Rogers, and also the film director John Ford, among other visitors. Other snapshots of the day captured the artist at play with members of the Carey family, his adopted son Jack, always seeming to twirling the rope. Neither Russell nor Carey could wield a lariat with the dexterity of Will Rogers, who, after years of displaying his roping skills in the rodeo arena and on the stage, introduced movie audiences to his talent with a lasso in the 1921 film Roping Fool. I think Al must have seen that when it first came to Cody here, probably. The following year, Russell paid homage to Russell's reputation as a riatero by including him as a central figure in this oil painting, The Stranglers. If you look at the head of the roper, it's clearly Will Rogers, and Will's roping ability was on display in a life or death scene. These two cowboys roping a bear. On more than one occasion in the early 1920s, Charles and Nancy Russell were guests at Rogers' sumptuous Beverly Hills mansion, which, with characteristic humor, Charlie termed Will's log cabin. Rogers also welcomed the artist to his Santa Monica ranch, which is now a state park, and to his movie sets, such as A Poor Relation in 1921. He eventually invited Russell, who was an able writer, to pen a screenplay, but the artist's offering apparently fell short of the mark and was never produced. I don't think I've ever seen it. If any of you find that, I'd love to know what he did with the screenplay opportunity. When Russell learned that Rogers was using makeup for the first time in his movie Doubling for Romeo, he flippantly tendered his services to as a makeup artist. Mischievous actor quickly agreed, but made things difficult by chewing gum, delivering a steady barrage of one-liners, and trying to bite the lipstick as the painter applied it. Despite such antics, within 10 minutes, Rogers was decorated with a full complement of lip rouge, eyebrow pencil, and lash drops. Some of you know what that is. Rogers and Russell may have been introduced initially in the Manhattan studio of Edward Boreen, a California cowboy and artist who in 1919 returned to his hometown of Oakland to pursue a career as an etcher and easel painter. Before leaving for the West Coast, Boreen had landed a role as a cowpuncher in a motion picture himself. The picture was, and I guarantee you've never seen it, The World Against Him. It starred none other than Elmo K. Lincoln, who was of Tarzan fame, one of the early Tarzans, and was shot at Saranac Lake in northern New York State, that beautiful western location, western New York, no doubt. On their sojourn to California, the Russells exchanged regular visits with Boreen and his wife Lucille, who in 1921 had moved from Oakland to Santa Barbara. During their 1923 West Coast stay, the Montanans rented a home in the coastal community, not only to be near the Boreens, but also close to the pool of new patrons for Russell's art. Charlie joined Ed Boreen for daily walks on the beach and spent at least one memorable evening in the company of Will Rogers at the Boreen's Pueblo-style home overlooking the Pacific Ocean, telling stories and rolling Bull Durham cigarettes until early morning hours. Although there's no direct evidence that Russell ever visited the set of Cecil B. DeMille's epic motion picture, The Ten Commandments, the first version, filmed on a beach 70 miles from the town of Santa Barbara in 1923, the Montana artist did produce a pair of drawings and a sculptural model of Egyptian girls about that time, and probably saw the movie as well. Russell later recalled the film and its star, Theodore Roberts, in a letter to an acquaintance that read in part, "A few years ago, you might have seen Moses and his bunch heading for the sea somewhere between Long Beach and Santa Barbara. Moses is here yet. I saw him the other day. I don't know what he's doing now, but it's a safe bet he can't write the Ten Commandments." In 1924, the Boreans and more than 24 other guests gathered at Harry Carey's ranch to celebrate Russell's 60th birthday. Jody Young, an aspiring artist and Russell's only real protege, recalled that Will Rogers served as his master of ceremonies for the occasion and kept the crowd rolling and laughing until they were weak. Ironically, DeYoung did not hear Rogers' patter, having become deaf himself by contracting meningitis in 1913 while working on the Tom Mix film, or a Tom Mix film, near Prescott, Arizona. DeYoung took up art while convalescing and, having read of Russell in a magazine article, appeared to him by mail for advice and criticism. The older artist responded with encouragement, and in 1916 invited him to work in his Great Falls studio. There, the pair typically communicated in sign language, a medium they also found happy for criticizing Western movies that they attended at the local theaters. I would like to have been at one. The artist was especially critical of the 1923 epic film, The Covered Wagon, which arrived by train at Great Falls for its 4-day run with a 15-piece orchestra. It was a big deal. Although promoters touted the movie's historical realism, and this is still silent film, Russell thought the filmmakers got lots of things wrong on the screen. His fellow Great Falls residents, however, did not appear to mind the inaccuracies, and by the 3rd day of the local run of the film, it had played to an estimated 6,000 people in 3 days at Great Falls. That seems like a lot of folks, but that's what the newspapers of the day recorded. The motion picture adaptation of the trail driving novel North of 36, released the following year and starring Jack Holt, was more to Russell's liking, probably because it was filmed on location in the Lone Star State and featured a herd of real longhorns. An advertisement for the film in the Great Falls Tribune even carried the ringing tribute endorsement from Russell, who proclaimed it, quote, "the best Western picture I have ever seen, and I saw The Covered Wagon." And you can see that at the top of the ad there. Charlie Russell's circle of friends among the California stage and screen fraternity grew larger with time, thanks in part to Charles Lummis, a prominent California writer, editor, and exponent of Southwestern culture. Invited to the artist's first exhibition in Pasadena in February 1920, Lummis afterwards wrote that he was, quote, "not prepared for the splendidly alive paintings, so virile, so true, so full of imagination, as well as fact, and poetry, as well as sanity." He was really taken. A month later, Charles and Nancy Russell accompanied Will and Betty Rogers to a gathering at Lummis's rock home, El Asal, which is just down the road from the Museum of the Southwest in Los Angeles, or what used to be the Museum of the Southwest. His home, El Asal, in northeastern Los Angeles, the first of several such visits. On another occasion, the writer and the artist were photographed together on a Los Angeles street in the company of Nancy Russell and the actor Harold Lloyd. Nancy's not in this picture, but she was there. The Russells' hand talk is said to have amused the Nebraska-born Lloyd, whose motion picture Cliffhangers engaged the same sense of anticipation in the audience as the artist's so-called predicament paintings, where you're on your edge of your seat to know what's going to happen. Some of you maybe remember Lloyd's work when he's hanging out of a skyscraper window 20 floors from by 1 foot. Russell's friendship with the likes of Charles Lummis, Will Rogers, Harry Carey, and Tom Mix had brought him into contact with other leading actors of the day, including Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, who purchased Russell's oil, the Navajos, from an exhibition at a Los Angeles gallery in April of 1921. Fairbanks promptly invited the Russells to join him on the set of his film, The Three Musketeers, where the artist took the opportunity to sketch the actor in his role of D'Artagnan, intending to paint him later. Although he never got around to rendering Fairbanks in oil, Russell did complete an equestrian sculpture of the debonair actor, again as the Musketeer D'Artagnan, in 1926. And he also wrote a letter of presentation, and there you see two horsemen from different generations acknowledging one another in the illustration. By the 1920s, Nancy Russell was selling her husband's work for almost as fast as he could produce it. Some of the best of it went to Los Angeles patrons. In 1923, but before I get to that, I probably ought to show you his work with Will Rogers that he created, the second work on horseback. By 1920, Nancy Russell was selling her husband's work almost as fast as he could produce it. Some of the best went to Los Angeles patrons. And in 1923, Nancy organized a successful exhibition at the Stendhal Galleries located in the Ambassador Hotel, and in the following 2 years repeated the feat at the Biltmore Salon. Employing the vernacular of stage and screen, the critic for the Los Angeles Sunday Times described the essence of the artist's work at the Biltmore. Russell knows the landscape that forms the vast theater that stages all the lively melodrama. What magnificent drop curtains, painted red with sunset gold and dawn purple with twilight. What simple and effective settings, distant mountain range, nearer mesa, still nearer mesquite and sagebrush and sand. Russell's curtains and Russell's sets are better today than they ever were. By this time, LA businessman Edward Doheny, who had bought 2 paintings, including the Salute to the Robe Trade, which I showed you, or I'm about to show you, from the 1924 Biltmore exhibition, had commissioned the artist to paint a 4-panel, 2.5 foot high frieze that extended more than 20 feet long in four different panels. And here you see it for his new home. You see part of the frieze running around the top of the Indian Room, as it was called in Doheny's home. The oil tycoon was then embroiled at that very moment in the federal bribery scandal over petroleum leases in Wyoming, known as the Teapot Dome, which you'll all remember, prompting Will Rogers to quip in the daily newspaper column that Charles M. Russell was the only one working in oil who managed to remain pure. Russell was said to have painted at least a part of Doheny's mural on the floor of the adobe bungalow that he used from the Harry Carey's ranch. By this time, Russell had become acquainted with the up-and-coming motion picture director John Ford, who had completed his first epic Western film, The Iron Horse, in 1924. It is perhaps no coincidence that Russell executed a watercolor titled Trail of the Iron Horse the same year. I've gone through trying to look, and you can find that film online, and I've looked trying to find where Russell might have, which scene might have inspired him, but I think he imagined this scene if he used it from the film at all. The plot of the film revolved around the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and Ford consulted historical photographs to give his film a more authentic look and feel. Toward that end, Toward the end of the movie, the director even recreated Andrew J. Russell's famous image from the Golden Spike ceremony that united the Union and Pacific lines at Promontory Point, Utah in 1869. The director's staging of scenes involving Plains Indians and bison and the Iron Horse, however, owed much to the oeuvre of Charles M. Russell. Scenes featuring mounted Indians pursuing stampeding bison, for example, were manifest in dozens of Russell paintings and sculpture. Ford was known to be a growing fan of Russell's work. And here you see Ford filming the stampeding buffalo in the film. He dug a hole and he asked his crew to get down there, and in order to get them to go, he got down there with them. And they stampeded a buffalo herd right over the top of them, giving them a rather unique view, as you can see in the film if you look at it. In the painting, a pair of, the ominous shadows, or the directors of staging of scenes involving Plains Indians and bison and the Iron Horse did owe a lot to Russell's work, and as did one particular scene in which the ominous shadows of Native American warriors appeared on a line of boxcars moments before tribesmen attacked a stalled train in the film. This scene, I believe, had its origins in Russell's widely reproduced work from 1915, The Shadows Hint Death. In the painting, a pair of white hunters and their horses hide in the shade of a canyon, while an Indian war party passes along the rim above their shadows, which are projected by the sun on the opposite wall of the chasm as if it were a motion picture screen. The art historian Alex Nemiroff contends that When Shadows Hint Death also acknowledges the growing influence of motion pictures and the declining impact of art in the portrayal of the Old West. Nevertheless, John Ford and a few others of his ilk continue to rely on the work of Western artists, including and especially Charles M. Russell, to create an authentic look and mood in their films. Monument Valley's iconic setting for Ford's later Westerns, for example, echoed the starring role that Montana's Square Butte country played in Russell's paintings. And you could see Square Butte in the back of When the Land Belonged to God. And you can also see one of the great mesas there in Monument Valley. Ford returned time and again to his useful compositional strategies evident in Russell's paintings. In such Ford classics as Stagecoach, The Searchers, and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, for example, scenes of horsemen traveling in silent procession across the colorful landscape referenced Russell's work, as did the director's practice of placing a knot of figures on a hill or other foreground elevation surrounded by a vast and empty desert landscape. He got that directly from Russell. Jody Young, who served as a historical advisor on several Western films in the 1930s to the 1950s, further extended the influence of Russell's art to Westerns made by such distinguished directors as Cecil B. DeMille, Howard Hawks, and George Stevens. Charlie Russell, who's seen here in his famous two-gun stance, would no doubt have been pleased to know that his work had contributed so importantly to the fabric of early Western cinema. Jody Young, who watched many of the films in his company, understood the depth of his mentor's passion for movies better than most. All he wanted out of life, DeYoung told the Great Falls newspaper reporter a few years before Russell's death, was a chance to work, his horses, friends to tell stories to, and the price of a picture show. Thank you. Anybody have any questions or anything they want to throw? Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's great being back.
Well, thank you, Byron. That was absolutely wonderful. And I just wanted to say thank you all again so much for coming today. It was wonderful to have all of you here. And I'm sure if you do have any questions, Byron wouldn't mind if you stopped by and asked. Otherwise, we hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.